The thermometer outside Daniel Carter's cabin read -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and dropping. In the 7 years he had lived in this remote stretch of Alaska's wilderness, he had never seen the temperature plunge this low. This wasn't just another winter storm. This was the kind of blizzard that tested even the toughest survivalists, the kind that reminded you how small you really were against nature. Daniel's cabin stood alone at the edge of a frozen valley, miles from the nearest road. The small wooden structure, built from weathered logs, had been his refuge since leaving behind city life. Once, he had been a wildlife researcher, traveling across national parks to study animal behavior. But after losing his wife, he had chosen solitude over society, trading crowded streets for the unforgiving beauty of the wild. That morning, everything seemed normal until he turned on his weather radio. A storm warning blared through the static. Temperatures would hit record lows, with winds strong enough to snap trees in half. Daniel moved with practiced precision, securing the cabin, checking the generator, and bringing in extra firewood. His life out here had made him disciplined, because out here, one mistake could be your last. By mid-afternoon, the first wave of snow arrived. Thick flurries swallowed the landscape, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The wind roared like a living thing, slamming against the cabin walls. Daniel pulled his coat tighter and fed the fire, preparing for a long, brutal night. And then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind, a low, deep moan, barely audible over the storm. Daniel froze. He had spent years studying wildlife. He knew that sound. It was a bear. His pulse quickened as he grabbed his flashlight and moved toward the frosted window. The beam cut through the swirling snow, but visibility was poor. Then, movement. At first, just shadows shifting in the whiteout. Then, as the wind briefly died down, he saw them, a mother bear and 2 tiny cubs. They were struggling, badly. The mother's usual powerful stride had become a slow, stumbling shuffle. Her cubs, no more than a few months old, were pressed tightly against her side, their small bodies shivering violently in the deadly cold. Daniel's stomach tightened. Bears should be hibernating. If this mother had left her den in the middle of a blizzard, something was very, very wrong. The bears moved closer to his cabin, their fur coated in ice. The mother paused, swaying on her feet, exhaustion visible in every movement. One of the cubs stumbled and collapsed into the snow. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The mother nuzzled the cub desperately, urging it to stand. The tiny bear tried but barely managed to lift its head before collapsing again. Daniel clenched his fists. He knew what this meant. The cold was winning. He had seen nature's cruelty before, but never this close, never on his doorstep. If he did nothing, by morning they'd be dead. Daniel stood frozen at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the struggling bears just beyond his porch. The mother bear barely had the strength to stand against the storm, her massive frame swaying with exhaustion. The cubs, much too small for this brutal cold, were curled tightly against her, their tiny bodies trembling violently beneath the snow. His instincts screamed at him to stay inside. Bears were dangerous. Even weak and starving, a mother bear would fight to the death to protect her cubs. Every survival guide he had ever read, every expert he had spoken to, had drilled one golden rule into his head: never interfere with wild animals. And yet, Daniel couldn't look away. The mother bear nudged one of the cubs, trying to get it to move. It didn't respond. She let out a low, guttural moan, a sound filled with desperation. Something inside Daniel twisted. He had spent years observing wildlife, documenting their triumphs and tragedies through his camera lens. He had always believed in letting nature take its course. But this was different. If he did nothing, by morning, these bears would be frozen solid. His heart pounded as he weighed his options. There was no way he could bring them inside his cabin. Having a half-ton grizzly in his living room wasn't an option. But There was the old storage shed. It was small, insulated, separate from his cabin, and most importantly, warm. He had built it years ago to store his photography gear, but now it could mean life or death for this mother and her cubs. The wind howled as Daniel made his choice. He pulled on his thickest coat, grabbed 2 heavy blankets, and unlatched the door. The moment it cracked open, the storm hit him like a freight train, a blast of snow and freezing air stealing his breath. The mother bear's head snapped up. Even through the darkness, he could see her golden eyes locking onto him. She didn't move, but Daniel could feel the tension in her body, a silent warning. Slowly, carefully, he stepped onto the porch, keeping his posture non-threatening. The bears were just feet away now, their fur crusted with ice, their breath slow and weak. With steady hands, he tossed a thick blanket onto the snow near the cubs. The mother flinched, her muscles tensing. For a terrifying second, he thought she might charge. But she didn't. Instead, she lowered her massive head, sniffing the fabric. Encouraged, Daniel moved toward the storage shed. He wrenched the door open, letting the faint warmth spill into the frozen air. Then he stepped back, giving her space. The mother bear lifted her head again, nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of shelter. She hesitated. Daniel held his breath. This was it. Then she turned, gripping the nearest cub gently in her powerful jaws, and slowly, painfully, began dragging it toward the open shed. Daniel could barely believe what he was seeing. She reached the threshold and paused, swaying, exhausted. The second cub remained in the snow, motionless. Without thinking, Daniel moved forward. His every instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn back, but he ignored it. With slow, careful movements, he scooped up the second cub. It was ice cold in his hands, barely breathing. The mother bear let out a weak, throaty growl, but it wasn't aggressive. It was the sound of a mother too exhausted to fight, yet terrified for her young. Daniel gently laid the cub beside its sibling in the shed. Then, without another word, he stepped back. For a long moment, the mother bear simply looked at him. Then, with one final effort, she staggered inside, curling her massive body protectively around her cubs. Daniel didn't wait. With shaking hands, he pulled the shed door closed, leaving just a small crack for fresh air. The bears were safe. For now. But Daniel knew the hardest part was yet to come. Daniel barely slept that night. The storm raged on, slamming against his cabin with terrifying force, but his mind was locked on the 3 bears inside the shed. Had he done the right thing? He had spent years living by one simple rule: never interfere with nature. He had watched animals struggle before, wolves starving in harsh winters, deer lost in deep snow, even bears fighting over scarce food. And he had always kept his distance. That was how it was supposed to be. But this time, when it mattered most, he had broken that rule, and he wasn't sure if it would save the bears or put them all in danger. By morning, the blizzard had finally begun to ease. The sky had turned a crisp, pale blue, the storm clouds retreating into the distance. A thick blanket of snow covered everything, smooth and untouched, except for the faint trail leading to the shed. Daniel pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The cold was still brutal, biting at his exposed skin, but the wind had finally died down. His boots crunched through the fresh snow as he made his way toward the shed, his breath curling in the icy air. Were they still alive? His stomach tightened as he reached for the door. He hesitated, then slowly pushed it open. A faint wave of warmth hit him. The insulation had done its job. Inside, the mother bear lay curled around her cubs, their small bodies pressed tightly against her for warmth. Then she opened her eyes. Their gazes locked. Daniel's pulse pounded. This was the moment of truth. The mother bear didn't growl. She didn't charge. She just watched him. And in that moment, something passed between them. A silent understanding. Daniel lowered himself slightly, staying calm, careful. He placed a small bowl of water just inside the door, then set down a few pieces of dried venison from his supplies. He knew bears could go for months without eating in hibernation, but after a storm like this, she needed her strength. The mother bear sniffed the air. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, cautiously, she stretched her massive head forward and licked at the water. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Over the next 2 days, the bears continued to recover. The cubs, once weak and motionless, began to stir, moving more with each passing hour. The mother stayed alert, but never once showed aggression toward Daniel. She seemed to understand that, for now, they weren't enemies. The storm had buried everything in feet of snow, making travel impossible. Daniel spent the time keeping the fire in his cabin burning, checking on the bears from a distance. By the third morning, the world outside had transformed. The sky was clear, the sun casting a brilliant glow over the freshly fallen snow. The worst was over. It was time. Daniel pulled on his coat and stepped toward the shed. This time, he didn't hesitate. He unlatched the door and pushed it open wide, stepping back. The mother bear lifted her head immediately. She sniffed the air, sensing the change. Her ears twitched, her body tense. Then, with quiet grace, she rose to her feet. Daniel took another step back, giving her space. The cubs hesitated at first, their tiny paws sinking into the deep snow, but their mother nudged them forward. And then, just as she reached the threshold, she stopped. She turned her head and looked directly at Daniel one last time. He wasn't sure what he saw in her eyes. Gratitude, understanding, or just instinct. Then, with surprising gentleness, she turned and led her cubs forward, disappearing into the trees. Daniel stood in silence, watching them go. He had spent years trying to disappear from the world, choosing solitude over connection. And yet, in just a few days, he had been reminded of something profound. Some things weren't meant to be observed from a distance. Some things demanded action. As the last glimpse of the bears vanished into the wilderness, he turned back toward his cabin, his breath curling in the morning air. He would never forget this moment, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel so alone. If this incredible story of survival and compassion touched your heart, don't miss out on more breathtaking wildlife encounters. Subscribe now and join our community of nature lovers as we bring you more real-life stories that showcase the extraordinary connection between humans and the wild. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We share heartwarming, unbelievable, and awe-inspiring moments every week. Would you have made the same choice as Daniel? Let us know in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button now and let's explore the wonders of nature together. உலகம் பற்றி பேசுகிறோம்.